Hey there, I'm glad you're back. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. This is going to be hell of a story as Eli Mercer looks for revenge of his dead wife. The previous part is linked in the description below. Be comfortable, here I begin. It was pain, that's the first thing I felt, like fire was eating through my ribs. My breath came slow, every inhale dragging knives across my lungs. My skull throbbed, my fingers twitched. Hell, I cannot even describe how it felt. Was it all a bad dream? I wasn't dead. I forced my eyes open. The ceiling above me was cracked, water-stained, and unfamiliar. A single lantern flickered on a wooden nightstand, looked around to see wooden walls and cobwebs. My body felt heavy, like I'd been thrown into the deep end of a frozen lake. Where the hell was I? I tried to sit up, but the body won't cooperate. Felt like all my joints are stuck. Pain, that's the one word to describe. It ran through my body, and I let out a sharp, involuntary groan. My left shoulder was wrapped in thick bandages, leg bandaged, ribs taped down tight. My leg ached like hell. For a moment it felt like I lost a leg. I wasn't in a hospital. Smell of old wood, medicine, and something musty, like damp earth. The room was small, the walls lined with dusty shelves filled with books and old tools. A sound came, boots on wood. The door creaked open, and an old man stepped inside. Gray beard, weathered face, sharp eyes, carrying a tin cup and set it down beside me without a word. I swallowed hard. Where am I? My cabin. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping metal. You were half dead on the road. Found you barely breathing. Your car, he shook his head. What's left of it is outside. The car? You mean my car? The memory slammed into me like a bullet to the chest. Where is my wife? I gripped the blanket, my breath quickening. I saw it in flashes. The road, the headlights cutting through the dark, Clara's laughter, the way her hand rested on mine. Then the fuckers, the dogmen, the crash, the glass breaking and the screaming. I closed my eyes. Where's my wife? The room went silent. The kind of silence that felt like an eternity. My fingers twitched as I forced it into a knuckle. The old man exhaled slowly. They found nothing, just blood and wreckage. I stared at him, my hands clenching into fists. Nothing? You mean not even her body? That wasn't possible. I should have died with her. My chest tightened. My jaw clenched so hard it ached. No body, no remains, gone. Just gone. Tears poured down my eyes as I wanted to scream so bad. What had happened? Why was it her and why not me? Then, there was a knock on the door. The old man stood, opening it without a word. Jesus Christ, Eli! I turned my head. Jim Johnson stood there, framed in the doorway. My oldest friend, his wife Carol, and their daughter Amelia hovered behind him. Johnson stepped inside, his face pale. He looked me over, his eyes scanning the bruises, the bandages, the wreck of a man lying in this stranger's bed. What happened to you and your wife that night? Word spread around the locals of a car accident. I didn't think it could be you. I cannot comprehend. How did it fucking happen? He muttered. When I didn't get any word from you after you left, I was worried. I didn't answer. Carol moved closer, her voice soft, grabbing my hand. Eli, if you need anything. I still said nothing. Amelia stood near the doorway, gripping the hem of her sweater. Her eyes were red, her voice small. Uncle Eli. I turned away. Johnson sat on the chair beside me, sighing heavily. Eli, what the hell happened? I swallowed hard. My voice barely made it past my lips. Werewolves, fucking werewolves. Johnson's expression didn't change. He just nodded. I exhaled, gripping the blanket tighter. My hands were shaking. I need revenge. The words tasted like blood. Johnson leaned forward. His voice was low, steady. Then get your ass out of this bed and do something about it. Gave me a sip of the whiskey that he carried around his pocket. Got any cigarettes? I asked. He offered me a packet of Marlboro with a lighter. I shall be around, Eli. Stay with us. In the meantime, I shall bring Caleb too, he replied. Leave me here for some days. Let death come, it doesn't matter anyway. I tried hard not to show my tears. Brother, I shall be around. I will bring here supplies, anything you need. I have given cash to this man to take care of you here. Stay low, things are messy, you're a strong guy. They fucked up with the wrong man, Jim said to my ears. I nodded. Then they left. I didn't heal fast. Days passed, then weeks. As soon as I could regain some strength, I told the old man, "Thank you for your hospitality," offered him some vintage coins of gold that I had all along in backseat of my car. Honestly and humbleness is as rare a virtue nowadays, and to be taken care in such a manner by a damn stranger, it's rare. Then I left. Days passed, just like that, drank myself into oblivion every goddamn night. Whiskey, beer, whatever I could get my hands on, no specific taste, anything that kept me away from the thought of not killing myself. Now and then I would stare for hours at the shotgun, thought a couple of times to blow my head off, but I couldn't. Whiskey burned, but not enough. Cigarettes, Chesterfield, smoked it till every last one of them gave way to the butt. Nothing was enough. I spent hours staring at the walls, playing Clara's voice in my head on repeat. I imagined her, all those memories, how she would hug me whenever I came home after each shady hunts. Her smile always welcoming. She was not the type of woman to express her love directly, but deep down I always how much she cared about me, about us, about the family. I would wake up in the middle of the night, now and then, looking at the doorway to see if she would enter with a smile. But she never did. One morning, Caleb found me slumped over the kitchen table, bottle still in my hand. My son, 17 years old now. He was built like me, strong and sharp-eyed. But there was something in his face I hadn't seen before. Disappointment was it? Dad? His voice was flat. I barely lifted my head. You're killing yourself. I didn't respond. Caleb sighed, shaking his head. If Mom was here, she'd slap the hell out of you. That almost made me look up almost. He stepped closer, his voice harder now. You want revenge? Then act like it. You're not the only person who miss Mom. Hell, you never have been there for us at home. You remember how many days went by with Mom smoking in that same goddamn corner, thinking about you. Then he turned and walked out. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My body ached. My head throbbed. But for the first time in weeks, there was silence. No whiskey, no numbness, just rage boiling in my chest. I sat up, swung my legs over the edge of the bed, packed some of my stuff, guns, ammunition gear, whatever was required, then headed straight for my son. Caleb, I shall be back soon. In the meantime, please be nice to your aunt. Then I left for my old farmhouse. It was miles away. Drive nearly took me 8 long hours. Took sips of the old whiskey and then I reached. The place was not less than the eerie scene of a haunted house, but it was comforting. Took me back to the memory of my first cryptid hunt, a Wendigo. The next morning, I started training. It was as hard as it should be. The body almost gave up with layers of slobby fats, but not my spirit. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups. Fucking punched the 160-pound heavy bag till my fist gave its way to teared-up skin beneath the gloves. At first, my body refused. My muscles screamed, my ribs ached, but I kept going. I ran through the fields, ran alone even in the dense woods nearby, didn't care about any cryptid attack. You know a man's dangerous as hell when he doesn't care about death, he rather embraces it. Lungs burning, legs pushing harder, but it felt good. The physical pain was necessary to keep the sorrow at bay. Rage, tremendous rage was building up. I visited an old shooting range, my hands shaking at first. Even the easiest target seemed difficult at first, like my hands, my focus, my breathing, every was messy. Then shot by shot, I got control. Faster, deadlier, it took me several weeks to get that precision back, and then didn't miss any target. Even the winds were calculated roughly in the head while taking the shots. My vision was getting sharper, my reflex was spot on. I trained with the old-fashioned knives, shotguns, pistols, until my hands bled, until my arms burned. The recoil from the continuous firing felt good, the shoulders got used to it. Months passed. I grew stronger than I had ever been before. Then one night, I opened a wooden crate in my garage. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was my old silver-plated revolver. I lifted it, feeling the weight in my grip. Spun the cylinder. Snapped it shut. I walked over to my shotgun, my Spaz 12, and pulled out my knife. Slowly, I carved her name into the black steel. For Clara. A mark of vengeance and a promise. I strapped the gun to my belt, pulled on my coat. Stepped outside into the night. I made it to my office room. The place was neatly decorated. Evelyn took care of the home. And there, piled neatly on my desk, were some letters. No return address, no markings, just my name. Someone knew I was coming back. I ripped open the first envelope. Welcome back, Mercer. I see the fire hasn't died. If you're ready, I have something for you. No signature, just coordinates at the bottom. I grabbed the second letter. I know what you're looking for. And I know who took her. My blood ran cold. The last letter was worse. You think you were the hunter. That night you were the prey. They let you live, Mercer. They wanted you to watch. My fingers clenched the paper. My vision blurred with rage. Whoever wrote this knew. They knew what happened to Clara. I exhaled, slow and sharp. They wanted me to find them. I was ready to oblige, blood raging through me, but I am not going to be played anymore. I kept my composure. Then I heard the footsteps behind me. It was Caleb. He walked in, saw the letters spread across the desk. He picked one up, reading. His face had no expression. What the hell is this? I didn't answer. He dropped the letter. You don't even know who this guy is. He knows things. Caleb scoffed. So what? You're gonna let some psycho coat send you on a wild goose chase? I turned to him. Caleb wasn't a boy anymore. He was almost my height now, strong, sharp, but he still didn't understand. This isn't a game, I said. I know it's not, he shot back. I was here, watching you drink yourself to death for 6 damn months. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't ready then. And now you are? He shook his head. Mom wouldn't have wanted this. I stepped closer. Don't you say her name like you understand what she wanted. His nostrils flared. She was my mother too. We stood there, the air thick with anger, grief, something unspoken. Finally, he exhaled sharply. I won't stop you. But if you go down this road, don't expect me to be waiting when you come back. I watched him walk away. I turned back to the desk. Soon he shall understand the line of work that we deal with. He accompanied me once to a hunt. The boy learned how to shoot the rifle under tense circumstances. Took him to see cryptids in real. We both hunt down a Wendigo, and since then he has changed a lot. He wants me to acknowledge him as a fellow hunter, not like a son. Someday I shall. After I am done dealing with greater things at play. Right now he is not ready yet. Young boys nowadays feel like they're grown up well before their time. Hell, I couldn't even blame him. I was no different when I was of his age. The next morning, I opened my secret armory. Steel walls, concrete floors, weapons lined neatly in locked compartments. I filled gas bombs with silver dust, prepped homemade grenades with silver shrapnel. I oiled the crossbow, the one that Jim Johnson gave me, the one that I shot the last Dogman, loaded the quiver with silver-tipped bolts, gave it a good polish. That things shined like new bride under the moonlight. Then I grabbed my Spaz 12. I ran my fingers over the engraving. Clara. This was the same gun that Clara held onto moments before she passed away. You know, my wife wasn't a typical woman. She was total freak, just like me, strong, robust. She knows that I deal with stuff that doesn't suit the common ear, and she never complained about my line of work. Somewhere she always felt that things in my line of work have repercussions. I am proud of her. Lit a cigarette, one from her favorite can, Chesterfield, and this shall be the last puff unless I am done finding answers and revenge. Then I set out for an old place, a place which had hidden things going just around the table, beyond your eyesight, McGrady's bar. A place where hunters, criminals, and liars drank under the same roof. I walked in. I remember a name, Duncan, that Russian guy who had been setting his eyes on juvenile specimens, Dogman, and that was a dangerous game. Fucker ran out of bounty money that paid for vampires, moved into the States, spent his money on hookers and weapons, but he did something wrong, disturbed the fine balance. I need to confront him. He owes me answers, and I have to be careful, especially when you understand that you're dealing with smarter evolved creatures, not the typical wolfmen under the moonlight with nonsensical howls and small brains. These cryptids are different. They know how to set traps, and my last encounter was fresh in my brain. I was looking for Duncan and the person who sent me those letters. The low murmur of voices dipped as I stepped to the bar. Whispers, glances. I wasn't forgotten. The bartender poured my drink without asking. Then a voice behind me sneered, "Didn't expect to see you here, Mercer." I turned, a hunter, mean grin, shark eyes. He leaned in. "Heard your wife got torn to shreds." That fucking question felt so painful. I stood up towering over him. "What did you fucking say?" Silence spread over. The whole bar faded. I moved fast, sucker punched him straight to the mouth. His head snapped back, blood spraying. He lunged at me. We crashed into tables, glasses shattered, chairs flying. I grabbed him by the collar, slammed his head into the bar, once, twice. "Where did you hear that?" I growled. He spat blood, smirked. "Everyone knows, Mercer. You're just the last to figure it out." I grabbed a broken bottle, pressed it to his throat. The bartender grumbled, "That's enough." I let go. The bar went still as I stood, every eye watching. I tossed back my drink, paid the bartender, and then walked out into the cold. My mind was occupied with different possibilities. The cold outside didn't seem to bother me. I was dead inside. There wasn't a heart for soft feelings anymore. The bastard should have stayed dead. I remember the white fur, slick with blood, its body slumped in the dirt, an arrow buried deep in its chest, and the face? I messed it up real bad with the shotgun, brains all over the ground, no sign of its face anymore. It was dead, it had to be. But it was gone. How did its fucking dead carcass just disappear? No drag marks, just a patch of blood-soaked earth, like the thing had evaporated into thin air. And the other one, the one that killed Clara, it was alive. Stay alive, you sucker. Nobody else has the right to kill you. It has to be me. Only Eli Mercer shall have you. I decided to visit the bar again. I hadn't found my answers yet. McGrady's bar was still recovering from my last visit. The broken tables had been replaced, but the stains of my last fight still clung to the floorboards. I found my first lead in the back corner, Billy Coyote Keener, a seasoned tracker with a taste for silver bullets and cheap whiskey. He looked up as I loomed over his table. "Mercer," he greeted, tapping ash from his cigarette. "What brings you back? Thought you'd crawled into a grave by now." I pulled out a chair, sat down slow, no small talk, no patience. "The white one," I said. "You heard anything?" Billy's smirk faltered. He took a long drag. "There's whispers," he admitted. "Some folks say the body got snatched. Others think you never killed it in the first place." I leaned in. "I know what I saw. That thing was dead. Nothing comes alive after having their brains blasted." Billy exhaled smoke. "Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe the other one, which was alive, took it." I grabbed his wrist, hard. The cigarette dropped from his fingers. "Start talking, Billy." His face twisted in pain. All right. I don't know much, but..." He glanced around, voice dropping. "There's a man outside of town. Stays in an old hunting lodge near Miller's Creek. He's been looking for someone like you." I released him. He clutched his wrist, rubbing it with a scowl. "If you're smart, Mercer," he muttered, "you'll walk away from this." I stood, tossing a few crumpled bills on the table. Never claimed to be smart. Miller's Creek was a lonely stretch of land, all mist and dying trees. The hunting lodge was more ruin than shelter, its wooden frame rotting from years of neglect. I knocked once, no answer. I knocked again, harder. The door creaked open, revealing a gaunt-faced man with tired eyes and a rifle resting in his lap. "You must be Mercer," he said. I stepped inside, scanning the cluttered room. Maps, newspaper clippings, and old photos were pinned to the walls. Half of them featured werewolves. I pointed at the pictures. "You hunting the same ones I am?" He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Son, I've been hunting them a hell of a lot longer than you." I didn't care, doesn't matter who had the longest kill streak. I pulled out a photo, a crude sketch of the white-furred werewolf that I had made before. This one, I said. I killed it, but its body vanished. His expression darkened. I know, he muttered. I stiffened. What do you mean, you know? He reached for a stack of papers, shuffling through them before tossing one in front of me. A newspaper clipping which read, "Local man found mutilated in forest, no signs of animal attack." Underneath was a grainy photo of a body, torn apart. The same night you killed that thing, this guy was found dead 5 miles away, the old hunter said. Something took that werewolf's body, Mercer, and it didn't waste any time. I clenched my jaw. Was it another werewolf? A packmate? Something worse? Why are you telling me this? I asked. The hunter exhaled. Because if you keep digging, you're gonna find something you wish you hadn't. I met his stare. That's the plan. Hunters don't trust easy. They don't talk unless they have to, which meant I had to make them talk. I found my next lead in a closed butcher shop behind an old gas station. Ray Malone, former bounty hunter, now a gun for hire. I kicked open the back door, grabbed him by the collar, and slammed him against the meat locker. He barely had time to react before I pressed my knife to his throat. I don't have time for bullshit, I growled. Tell me what you know about the white-furred werewolf. Ray chuckled. You're insane. I twisted the blade, drawing a thin line of blood. You have no idea. He hissed. All right. I don't know much, but I heard there is a different kind, one who lingers among humans. I froze. What? Someone in town, he said. What the fuck was he saying? It didn't even make any sense. This wasn't just a mindless pack. I stepped back. Ray exhaled in relief. Then I punched him in the gut. He doubled over, wheezing. What the hell? I told you what I know. I grabbed his face, forcing him to meet my eyes. If I find out you're lying, I'll be back, I promised. I left him gasping on the floor. The next night, a letter arrived at my house. No sender, just a name scrawled in red ink, Hollow Jack. I tore it open. Inside was a single sentence. You're close, Mercer. Too close. Keep digging, and you'll end up like Clara. The name Hollow Jack was new in town. No one seemed to know much about him, but a name like that, whispered between gritted teeth, had an air of violence to it. Hollow Jack didn't belong here, and that was the only certainty people had about him. I spent my nights in the town's faded, forgotten corners. The streets were narrow and uneven, winding through old brick buildings that looked like they had been built to outlast time itself. The pavement was slick from the evening rain, reflecting the dull yellow of street lamps that flickered as if they too were tired of the world. Every now and then, the echo of distant howls from animals outside the town would creep into the background, a reminder that the wild was never far away. McGrady's bar still had the same patrons, the lost souls, the drifters, the ones who lived in the shadows of their own lives. The kind of people you wouldn't trust with your last dollar, let alone your life. The girls who worked their war dresses that had seen better days, their eyes tired but still sharp, sizing you up the moment you walked in. They moved like ghosts around the bar, their heels tapping a rhythm that matched the clinking of bottles and the low hum of broken conversation. A couple of old-timers hunched over their beers, casting wary glances toward the door, as if they knew something was coming, but didn't want to be the first to say it. I wasn't here for idle chatter or cheap thrills. My name on the bar was not glorious either. I had a bad reputation. Tonight I was looking for something or someone. It was always the same. I walked in, paid my dues to the bartender, and asked the same questions. Heard anything about Hollow Jack? It was a name people spoke with their eyes down, as if saying it out loud would summon the very thing they were trying to avoid. The girls? They were no different. The young brunette with the faded red lipstick didn't answer my question, but I saw the way she glanced over her shoulder toward the back room when I mentioned Hollow Jack's name. The older woman, her blonde hair streaked with silver, stared at me like I was a problem she didn't want to deal with. They all knew something, but none of them were talking. I managed to find out some details about his outlook. My instincts tell me this was the guy I needed to hunt down to solve the puzzle. I wasn't in the mood for games. Late at night, I left the bar and made my way down the streets, past the flickering lights and boarded-up shops. The cold air cut through the thin jacket I wore, but I didn't care. My mind was occupied with one thing: finding Hollow Jack, the man who had come to this town with no past and no future. He was a phantom, a shadow cast by the town's desperate past, and I needed to know why he'd chosen to show up now. I turned into a narrow alley behind the old gas station, my boots making muffled sounds against the wet pavement. The place had been abandoned years ago, the paint on the walls chipped, the windows covered with grime. I caught the scent of something unfamiliar: leather, smoke, and a faint trace of cologne. It wasn't a smell I could place, but it was the kind that stuck with you, like something that didn't belong but still lingered. I passed by the alley's mouth and saw a figure standing near the entrance of a building. Tall, his face obscured by the shadows, yet somehow familiar. All the details seemed to match suddenly. Yes, he was Hollow Jack. He had a presence, a certain quiet authority about him. His clothes were rugged: torn jeans, worn leather jacket, and boots that looked like they had seen the world, but he wore them like they were made for him. His long, dark hair hung loosely over his shoulders, wild but controlled. I caught a glimpse of him as I turned the corner, and he didn't seem to notice me, even though the street was empty. His gaze was fixed ahead, as though he was waiting for something or someone. But there was no mistaking it. There was something predatory about him. His posture was straight, shoulders squared. And his eyes? Dark, calculating. They flicked across the street for just a second, but in that brief moment, it was like he knew exactly where I was, exactly who I was. And that unsettled me. I stepped back, blending into the shadows as best as I could. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. But I had to know more. I had to understand who this Hollow Jack really was. There was something about this place, something about the way the air felt heavier, as if everything was on the verge of collapsing into chaos. I waited, watching him for another minute before he slowly turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't follow him immediately. Instead, I lingered in the alley, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The man was dangerous, of that I was certain. But what else was there? What was his endgame? I knew one thing: Hollow Jack wasn't just another stray wolf on the prowl. There was something more to him. He had come to this town for a reason. And whatever that reason was, I was going to find out before ending this story. The sound of something moving in the distance, a low growl, a shift in the shadows, caught my attention. The town was never truly quiet, not when things like Hollow Jack were lurking just out of sight. I turned and made my way back to the bar, the cold pressing against my skin, but the chill wasn't from the weather. It was something else, a warning, an omen. I couldn't help it. My feet moved before my mind could catch up. Despite every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave Hollow Jack alone in the dark corners of the night, something inside me refused to let him slip away. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the empty streets of Michigan. Something about the full moon nights weren't always right. All the years of cryptid hunts tells me tonight may be the moment I was preparing for. The quiet hum of distant cars and the occasional rustle of leaves were the only sounds as I slid into my Mustang and started the engine. The streets of this part of town were always empty at night. Neon lights from late-night diners flickered, casting strange shadows that danced on the wet pavement. I passed the familiar landmarks: the abandoned laundromat, the cracked sidewalks, the liquor store with a flickering "open" sign that no one ever seemed to notice. I followed Hollow Jack's movements from the car, watching him slip into the shadows as he moved with the fluidity of something unnatural. My mind raced, my primal instinct awakened as the full moon overhead lit the street in a cold, haunting light. I knew what that meant. I had hunted werewolves before, tracked them down, killed them, but something tells me that this fucker isn't a human. He has to be a different entity. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he something more? A shapeshifter? Something that Jim Johnson, my old friend, warned me about, a man who could shift between forms at will. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the alley where he disappeared. I pulled the Mustang into a side street, the tires screeching briefly against the wet asphalt as I parked it against a cracked wall. I had my shotgun, Spas 12 on me, and the standard Winchester. As I stepped out of the car, I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the chill in the air sinking deep into my bones. The night had grown colder. The wind picked up, sending paper and trash skittering across the cracked pavement. The alleys looked like something out of a movie, a dark, damp labyrinth of forgotten buildings and rusted fire escapes. The whole town felt abandoned, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I followed the trail through the alleys, my steps slow, cautious. Then, as I rounded a corner, I saw him again. Hollow Jack stood at the end of the alley, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. The moment I saw him, my breath caught in my throat. It was happening. His back arched as his body began to change. The streetlights caught the glint of his skin, and I saw the first tear in his clothes as they began to stretch and rip, unable to contain what was coming. His shoulders bulged, muscles shifting and swelling beneath the fabric, tearing at the seams. His arms twisted, bones cracking and reshaping as his hands lengthened, the claws sprouting from his fingertips like a nightmare made flesh. But it was his face that I couldn't take my eyes off. His jaw widened, lengthening, skin pulling tight over the bones, his teeth lengthening into vicious fangs. His eyes, once a dark, calculating brown, glowed amber in the moonlight. The growl that escaped him wasn't human. It was guttural, deep, vibrating the air around me like the roar of a predator. This was a classic scene just like the ones that you've seen in old werewolf movies. It was the first time I had seen a werewolf shift this way, in such brutal detail. My pulse hammered in my chest as I gripped the shotgun tightly. Well, in my line of work, this should be natural, right? After hunting wendigos that were the skin of its victims, dead hikers, animals alike. Seen lot of things, tonight was no different. His transformation was almost complete when I heard voices approaching from around the corner. A group of kids, teenagers, probably around 2004 vintage, still wearing the uniforms of their youthful rebellion, stumbled into the alley, laughing and shouting. A few of them were drunk, their steps unsteady as they wandered, oblivious to the danger just a few feet away. One of them, a skinny kid in a denim jacket, held a bottle of something cheap and swayed on his feet. "They say this place is haunted, man," one of the girls giggled, holding onto her friend as they both stumbled into the alley. "Whatever," the guy with the bottle slurred. "It's all rumors. There ain't no ghosts here. Just a couple of freaks like us." They were right about one thing. This place was haunted, but not by ghosts. Hollow Jack, now fully transformed, his body rippling, crouched down low, his claws scraping the ground as he prepared to lunge. His eyes flicked over the group of teens, and I could see the hunger in them, predatory, cold. I didn't have time to think. I reacted. Without hesitation, I raised my shotgun, aimed for Hollow Jack's torso, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out through the alley, but I missed. The blast scraped across his side, tearing through the air with a burst of silver, but it barely fazed him. He howled a spine-chilling sound that echoed down the alley as he whirled toward me, his face twisted in fury, locking his eyes in my direction. Before I could react, he was on me. His claws raked through the air as he leapt, his massive body crashing into mine with the force of a freight train. I felt the impact in my bones as he knocked me to the ground, his mouth opening wide, showing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed like a sick joke under the moonlight. I barely had time to bring my shotgun up before Hollow Jack's jaws snapped shut just inches from my face, a growl reverberating deep in his chest. I pushed back with all my strength, but he was too strong, too fast. His weight was crushing me, and the smell of him, that foul stench of wet fur and blood, filled my nostrils as he snarled above me. His claws digging into the ground as he loomed over me. He had pieces of jeans hanging from his legs, fabrics attached to some part of the body, veins pulsing out from his ribs. My fingers were slick with sweat, but I still gripped the Winchester tight, the barrel cold against my palm. I fired. The shot hit the leg. Hollow Jack's body shivered violently as the blast tore into his flesh, a satisfying crack echoing. It gave me a moment to breathe, but I knew it wouldn't last. Before I could steady my aim for another shot, his claws lashed out again. Still pinned to the ground, I pulled the trigger, but the shot missed, the blast flying wide as Hollow Jack moved with terrifying speed. I barely had time to process what happened before the air rang with the sound of another gunshot, this one much farther away. A bullet hit Hollow Jack square in the abdomen, throwing him back with a grunt, causing him to stagger and fall, splinters of fresh concrete visible at the bottom where the claws slipped by in the action. Hollow Jack, now caught by surprise, gave me a grim look. He stood on two legs, his jaws retrenched back as his eyes glowed with the same malice as mine. I didn't wait. I rose to my feet in one swift motion, bringing my shotgun to bear again. 2 quick shots rang out. The pellets flew in the same direction as he scrambled toward the edge of the alley. With a snarl, Hollow Jack vanished into the shadows, his massive form melting into the darkness of the woods that bordered the town. I froze for a moment, unsure of what had happened. But then I heard the voice, gravelly, with a thick Russian accent. "You're welcome, I am the Russian guy, must have heard about me," stepping out of the shadows, a rifle in hand. He was tall, rugged, with a face that had scars that were no ordinary ones. Kids would run to their mothers with even a slight glimpse of his damn cursed face. The night was still. Duncan stood beside me, his rifle still raised. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. "You must be the one hunting juvenile werewolves?" I muttered, "You know the cost. These things are hunting down innocent families now. Do you even understand the meaning of repercussions?" He stayed silent. My fingers trembled slightly as I lit a cigarette, the sharp crackle of the match slicing through the stillness of the night. The taste of tobacco soothed my nerves, but there was still that gnawing hunger inside me. Duncan, the Russian bounty hunter, stood across from me, silent, his eyes like steel, his expression unreadable. He pulled a cigarette from the pack, lit it with a practiced flick, and took a long drag. The smoke curled up into the night air, drifting away like a memory. "Damn," he said, exhaling slowly, his gravelly voice barely audible. "You ever notice how quiet it gets before a storm?" I looked over at him, taking another drag from my own cigarette, then flicking the ash off into the dark. "Yeah," I muttered, "it's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's watching you. Like the calm before a monster jumps out of the trees and rips your face off." "I never used to think about it much," he continued, his eyes staring out into the blackness like he was seeing something I couldn't. "The quiet. But once you see enough shit, you start to listen. You start to hear the things that the normal people miss." I leaned back, staring into the fire, letting his words sink in. I had my own reasons for being here, and none of them had anything to do with peace and quiet. But as I looked over at Duncan, I started to see the cracks in the walls he'd built around himself. He wasn't just some Russian psychopath who got off on hunting monsters for cash. There was more to him. There had to be. "So, what's your story, Duncan?" I asked, taking a drag. "How'd you end up in this cryptid hunting business?" He took another drag from his cigarette, his jaw tightening, his gaze still focused on something far away. "Long story," he muttered, flicking the ash off his cigarette. "But you want to hear it? All right, it started in Siberia." I raised an eyebrow, my face expressionless, intrigued despite myself. "Siberia? Sounds like a good place to get your heart broken, or freeze your ass off." He let out a humorless laugh. "Siberia, it's a cold place, yeah. But that's not the worst part. My daughter, my only daughter, she was taken by a vampire." I took another drag, the smoke filling my lungs, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Vampire?" I repeated, feeling the weight of the word hanging in the air. "How does a vampire even get to her?" "Simple," he replied, his eyes now dead on mine, cold and distant. "They come at night. You don't even hear them coming. They're sneakier than anything you've ever seen. One minute she was there, laughing in the kitchen. The next, nothing, just a dead body, like blood sucked dry of a corpse." I stared at him, trying to wrap my mind around it. The pain in his eyes, the expression in his scarred face, I couldn't look away. I felt the same pain when my wife was taken that fateful cold night. "So you started hunting after that?" I asked quietly. He nodded slowly, taking another drag, his eyes never leaving the fire. "Had to. No one else was going to do it. I tracked that bastard for months, killed it finally, but it didn't bring her back." The silence hung heavy between us, and I could almost feel the weight of the years he'd spent hunting, the toll it had taken on him. He was just like me, broken. He wasn't just a headless hunter after all. I was wrong about him. This man had emotions, the kind of emotions that only a dead man can feel. "I get it now," I said after a long pause, flicking my cigarette into the fire. "You're not just in this for the money." He nodded again, but his face softened just a little. "Maybe, but you don't get to ask questions like that unless you're ready for the answer." I leaned back, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Yeah, I'm ready for a lot of things, but I'm starting to think this shit gets worse before it gets better." Duncan glanced at me, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Maybe respect, maybe understanding. "You're not wrong. Things always get worse before they get better. But you keep pushing forward. It's the only way." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere off in the distance, an owl hooted, its call echoing through the night. I was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion settling in, but something about Duncan's presence kept me awake. He wasn't the monster I thought he was. In that silence, I realized something. Duncan and I were the same. He was just a man trying to live with what he'd lost. I was just a man trying to track down what had stolen from me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. "So what now?" I asked, breaking the silence. He looked over at me, his eyes narrowing, his lips curling into a small smirk. "Now we find Hollow Jack. And we make sure it doesn't walk out of here alive." I smiled back, flicking the last of my cigarette into the fire. "That's the plan. You know, this feels like something straight out of a movie." Duncan raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" I grinned. "Something like the Terminator. You know, where we keep getting knocked down, but we get back up anyway." He laughed. A real, honest-to-God laugh. "I think that's a pretty good way to look at it, Mercer. Now let's finish this hunt. The Terminator can wait." He replied in his low-pitch Russian accent. We both followed the werewolf's trail. We did make it bleed, but the game wasn't over yet. Signature footprints, covered in drops of blood, half looked like a man's feet yet elongated wolf-like claw marks. This monster was at least 7 feet tall in his transformed state. The trail led us towards the dense woods. The Michigan woods were dense, thick with trees that seemed to swallow every sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an owl. The night was alive with the hum of insects, the soft flicker of fireflies drifting through the underbrush, and the occasional snap of twigs beneath the weight of some unseen creature. Duncan was leading the way, his eyes scanning the shadows as he moved with purpose, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor. His bald head gleaming faintly under the moonlight. I was behind him, following closely. "I told you, Mercer," Duncan muttered, "these woods are haunted. Every hunter worth their salt knows that. Hell, some of these places are older than the country itself. You ever heard of the Pine Barrens?" Duncan's voice broke the silence, low and steady, as if he wasn't even out of breath. I raised an eyebrow. "You seriously going to tell me ghost stories now, Duncan?" He gave me a sideways glance. "Not ghost stories. Truth. These woods, they're not what they seem. You think it's all just trees and animals, but there's history here. Bad history." I kept my eyes forward, scanning the trees. "Haunted woods. I'm not sure I'm buying into it." Duncan gave a quiet chuckle. "You will when you see what's out here. They say that the deeper you go, the more you start to see things. Things that shouldn't exist." "I've seen things," I muttered, tightening my grip on the shotgun. The cold metal of the weapon reminded me of what we were here to do. "No ghost stories needed." Duncan's eyes narrowed. "We're close," he whispered. "Stay sharp. The beast is wounded, and you know the wounded ones are the most dangerous." We moved quietly now, The only sounds the occasional scrape of branches against our jackets and the distant hoot of an owl. But the atmosphere in the woods had changed. The air felt heavier, as though the very trees were holding their breath. A carcass of an animal, a deer, maybe, lay half buried in the underbrush. Its eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, its body picked clean by something with a much larger appetite than nature could explain. Then we saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, the ground was disturbed, deep gouges in the earth, large and deliberate. It was the unmistakable sign of a werewolf's lair. Hollow Jack had been here. His scent, a mix of blood, sweat, and something unnatural, lingered in the air. Duncan crouched low, pulling a small device from his pack. The trap. He didn't need to say anything. We both knew what we had to do. We moved quickly, setting up a perimeter of traps, springs that would clamp down on Hollow Jack's legs, snares that would tangle him up if he tried to escape. Duncan worked with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, each movement calculated, efficient. I stayed close, watching the woods for any movement. As the final trap was set, the tension in the air was palpable. I could feel it in my bones, the calm before the storm. Hollow Jack was close. He was coming. And then, as if on cue, the trees behind us rustled. As if the woods themselves were listening, something in the distance growled, a low, rumbling growl. Duncan froze, his head jerking toward the sound. His fingers twitched toward his rifle. "Get ready," he murmured. "It's close, too close." I nodded, my senses on high alert. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as the woods closed in around us. We were closing in on Hollow Jack's lair, but I could feel something watching us. The woods weren't just alive. They were waiting for something. Waiting for us. And then it happened. The sound of a twig snapping somewhere to our right was like a gunshot in the silence. Duncan's body tensed, his rifle rising, but before he could react, a massive shape emerged from the underbrush. Hollow Jack, in all his monstrous glory, tore through the trees like a nightmare brought to life. He was a beast, massive, hunched, covered in matted fur, covered in blood that glistened in the moonlight. This thing had recovered from the wounds already. His eyes glowed a fierce yellow, the color of dying stars. His claws were long, curling like sickle blades, and his teeth, God, his teeth, were as long as daggers. A deep snarl tore from his throat as he spotted us, his muscles rippling under his thick fur, every inch of him exuding raw power. Without a moment's hesitation, Duncan opened fire, but the beast dodged, moving faster each bullet that hit only made him stagger slightly, his skin sizzling where the silver touched, but it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. "Move!" Duncan shouted, shoving me aside as it lunged toward him. The werewolf's massive jaws snapped shut just inches from Duncan's face. He barely dodged, his rifle swinging to the side as it swiped at him with a clawed hand, knocking him backward. I wasn't sure how I made it, but I reacted on instinct. I raised my shotgun and fired. The blast of silver rounds hit Hollow Jack square in the chest, causing him to rear back with a roar of fury. The beast's fur burned where the silver hit, but it didn't stop him. It didn't slow him down. I tried again, 2 more shots aimed straight at his face, but the beast was too quick, too strong. He darted out of the way with the kind of speed that I had never encountered in any werewolf before. I swore under my breath, frustration rising in my chest. This wasn't working. None of it was working. Duncan scrambled to his feet, firing at the creature once more. This time, Hollow Jack caught his rifle mid-shot, his massive hand snapping it in half like a twig. The force of the blow sent Duncan crashing to the ground, his leg catching in the bramble as the werewolf loomed over him. Hollow Jack's eyes locked onto Duncan. The man had no weapon now, and with a snarl, the beast lunged. Everything seemed to slow down. I could see it all, its teeth coming down toward Duncan's exposed throat, his massive jaws gaping wide, ready to finish him off. But I wasn't about to let that happen. With a howl of my own, I charged forward, shotgun raised. The werewolf's attention snapped toward me, his yellow eyes flashing with contempt as he turned to face me. He growled, a deep rumble from his chest, but I didn't hesitate. I dove forward, sliding on the damp earth. My body hit the ground with a painful thud, but I didn't care. The shotgun was in my hands, aimed right at Hollow Jack's chest as he lunged. Time seemed to freeze. I squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded in gunfire. 3 shots. 3 silver rounds. Each one hitting their mark as Hollow Jack sailed through the air, his jaws snapping in fury, but too late. The first shot caught him in the shoulder, the second in his gut. The third, right in his chest, slamming into his heart. The werewolf let out an earth-shattering roar of pain as his body twisted and contorted in midair. His eyes bulged, his muscles spasming uncontrollably as the silver worked its poison through his body. He crashed to the ground, the impact sending a shockwave through the forest. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in heavy gasps as I watched him twitch on the ground. Hollow Jack was dying. But he wasn't done yet. I wasn't taking any chances. I walked over to him, my boots squelching in the mud, and fired one last shot, this one straight into his head. It was over, but I had to reassure it. So shot it over and over again at the thing that lay on the ground, a naked human. My grip on the shotgun barrel firm as it read, "For Clara." Duncan was already up, limping toward me with a pained grunt. His leg was a mess, but he was alive. He looked down at the mangled body of Hollow Jack and spat in disgust. "Damn, Mercer," he said, rubbing his leg. "That was a hell of a shot." This wasn't the end. The woods were still too quiet. The shadows felt deeper, darker. Duncan, gritting his teeth, staggered to his feet. "Let's get the hell out of here before we attract any more attention." I nodded, barely listening, my mind still racing. But as I looked back at Hollow Jack's carcass, I knew one thing for sure. The night had changed. We had killed Hollow Jack. But whatever else was out there, whatever new thing was waiting in these woods, it wasn't finished yet. Duncan packed some part of the human flesh in his bag, with wolf-like fur still protruding out. It's dirty work after all the damage, but still it was part of the job, brings souvenir. And money, if it attracts the right buyer. The atmosphere was thick as we walked away from the woods, the weight of Hollow Jack's death hanging over us like a cloud. The forest had swallowed the body of the beast, but I still felt it lingering in the darkness. Maybe it was just the silence that followed a hunt, the unnatural quiet after a life had been extinguished. Duncan and I didn't speak much during the walk back to the car. His leg was hurting, deep bruises and lacerations, and his usual gruff expression was darker than I'd seen it before. I didn't blame him. He'd taken a beating from that damn creature, and though I'd helped him out in the end, I knew it would take more than a couple of shots to put him back on his feet. When we reached my Mustang, I could tell Duncan was itching for a cigarette. His fingers twitched around the pack in his jacket pocket, and I didn't stop him as he lit up. The flare of the lighter illuminated his scarred face, casting a brief shadow over the intricate tattoos that sprawled across his neck and arms. I leaned against the car, trying to process everything that had happened. But then, Duncan's gruff voice broke the silence. "Got something else for you." I raised an eyebrow, watching as he pulled something from Hollow Jack's bloodied jacket pocket. A crumpled license plate. I frowned, taking the plate from him. There was something off about it, something about the way the metal glinted in the moonlight. Duncan took a drag from his cigarette, not watching as I examined it. "It was tucked in his pocket," he muttered. "Found it in his torn clothes left in the alley. Thought it might be worth something." I flipped the plate over. A single address was scrawled on the back in smudged ink. It wasn't much, but I knew it was enough. I had a hunch about what I'd find when I looked at it. The address read, 312 Ironwood Drive, North Michigan. I tossed it into the car's passenger seat, locking eyes with Duncan. He didn't say anything, but his raised eyebrows said enough. "What do you think?" he asked, blowing out a stream of smoke. "Think it's where we're headed next," I replied. My voice sounded almost empty. Hollow, there was something cold in my chest now. The last vestiges of Hollow Jack's presence were still weighing on me, but this was different. The ride to the cabin was quiet, except for the occasional rattle of the engine and the hum of tires on asphalt. As we crossed over into the North Michigan woods, the landscape began to shift. The trees got taller, denser, and the air grew colder. It was a haunted place. We passed by old, rotting houses on the outskirts of town, forgotten memories left to rot. It wasn't long before we found ourselves on a narrow dirt road. At the end of it stood a cabin, a small, weathered structure surrounded by overgrown grass and thick brush. The place looked abandoned. I parked the car in front, both of us getting out. Duncan limped slightly, his legs still bleeding from the earlier fight. But he was ready to keep going. He'd always been that way, relentless. We approached the cabin slowly, our footsteps heavy on the gravel. The place was isolated, the kind of setting you see in old horror movies where the protagonist knows that something's going to jump out at them. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. I stepped up onto the porch. I reached for the door. The handle was cold and stiff when I twisted it, but it opened with a creak. The smell of decay hit me instantly, but I ignored it, stepping into the darkness of the cabin. The only light came from the moon, which streamed through the cracked windows, casting long shadows over the rotting floorboards. And then I saw it, the remnants of Clara. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the center of the room, a tattered sheet had been thrown across a pile of what could only be her remains. Those clothes, torn, blood-stained that had been dried, lay scattered across the floor. And underneath the sheet, something far worse. Her bones. It was all I could do to stop my knees from buckling as I approached the pile. I could see her torn jacket, the fabric so familiar to me. The ring she had worn. The very same one I had slipped on her finger on our wedding day. A scream built in my chest, but I swallowed it. I wasn't about to break down. Not now. Not when I'd finally found her. Not when I had waited so long for this moment. I knelt beside her remains, trembling as I reached for the tattered remains of her jacket. It felt like time had stopped as I gently moved the cloth away, revealing her bones beneath, their once warm skin now cold and lifeless. My heart stuttered in my chest. The remains beneath the sheet, her bones, her clothing, the remnants of the woman I had loved, were all scattered across the floor like a puzzle I could never put back together. I felt sick to my stomach. The anger that coursed through me burned hotter than any fire. The thought of her, helpless, torn apart by that damn beast hollow jack, twisted something deep inside me. Months had passed since that night, the night that the two fucking werewolves attacked us. It was Hollow Jack and his partner. I remembered it like it was yesterday. The moon was full, casting its eerie glow over the roads, when our car was ambushed. Clara had screamed as the werewolf lunged at us, tearing through the vehicle with ease, its claws raking across the metal. The car overturned, and that's when everything went black. I managed to kill one with the crossbow, moments away from death, but Clara, she didn't make it. My hands gripping the shotgun hard as the memory hit my soul. The thought of that night, of Hollow Jack and his partner, the ones responsible for her death, had driven me for so long. I'd spent months chasing their scent, digging through the shadows, looking for any clue that would lead me to them. And now I was here, staring at the final piece of this twisted puzzle. As I moved closer to the remains, I noticed something strange. Bones, not just the remains of Clara. There were more bones scattered around the cabin. Dozens of them, some half buried under piles of rotting cloth and furniture. The more I looked, the clearer it became. These weren't just any bones. These were the bones of other victims. Other souls who had been lost to Hollow Jack and his dark life. Duncan stepped forward, his expression hardening as he took in the sight of the bones. "This guy's been around for a long time," he muttered, his voice low. "Way too long." I glanced at him, not sure if I wanted to hear what he was about to say. But then he pointed to something that made my stomach drop further. A set of old, cracked leather-bound books on a shelf. I walked over to them, hesitating before I flipped them open. Each page was filled with writings, names, dates, and pictures. The sketches weren't great, but they were unmistakable werewolves, different kinds, different times. And there it was, right on the page, Hollow Jack. This was a record of his life, his entire existence. Hollow Jack had been alive for more than 300 years. I felt the room closing in on me. This wasn't just some wild animal. This was a creature that had existed for centuries, feeding on the world, leaving behind a trail of death that stretched across the years. I was hunting something far worse than just a werewolf. I was hunting a monster that had been playing the long game, killing, hiding, and surviving long after the rest of us had forgotten his name. "Duncan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "This guy's older than we thought." "I know," Duncan replied, his voice grim. "Been in the game long enough to leave a mark on the world." "We're not done," I muttered, my eyes on Clara's remains. We left the cabin, the silence around us now louder than the screams of the past. The dark woods behind us, we made our way back to the bar, the weight of Clara's death still pulling at my heart. The revenge felt like a hollow victory, but at least it was done. And as Duncan and I went our separate ways, I knew this hunt was over. But I'd never forget the price of revenge. You know, hunters like us, we got a story, sometimes of adventure, sometimes of glory, but all that matters is that hunting one bastard implies saving 100 innocents. I reached my house, mixed feelings. I gently keep the ring in my drawer. Now, puffing the last cigarette to its filter, journal in my hand, I think of my son. Someday he will have a story to tell. A story of gloriful hunts. If you like today's story, do hit a like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon. Thank you for listening.